This is America, where the right to vote is foundational, but the rules governing that right are constantly being rewritten. As Republicans push for stricter voter eligibility requirements and Democrats fight to expand access to the ballot box, a political battle over how Americans vote is intensifying ahead of the midterm elections. I'll have more on that a little later in the show, but to start us off first, here's Rob Matheson in our Washington studio.
Thanks, Manny. Now, President Donald Trump says his Save America Act is going to guarantee that only U.S. citizens are going to be allowed to vote. Polls show that over 50% of people agree with that, but he's got a couple of problems. First, it's already illegal for non-citizens to register for elections. So people are asking, why is this happening? And why is it happening now? Donald Trump says the federal government should be in charge of elections instead of state officials. And that's his second problem. It would require changing the Constitution.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
For safety and security and for the good of our nation, if you went to paper ballots and you're voting, impossible to copy, impossible to cheat, and same-day voting. And if you went to voter ID, and also one other thing, you want a proof of citizenship. But some of these states, you had 64 days.
Well, President Trump's also said that if the act is passed, Democrats would never win an election again. His critics say that's the real reason he's pushing the act.
It'll guarantee the midterms. It'll guarantee the midterms. Save America, sir. Save America Act. We want the Save America Act, sir. And if you send it up there, you're going to win the midterms at levels that you can't even believe. And you're going to win every election for a long time until somebody really screws things up, and hopefully that won't happen.
So what exactly is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, and who's it likely to impact the most? Manuel Rapolo untangles it for us.
Republicans and Democrats both agree that only citizens should be able to register to vote in federal elections, but they take very different approaches when it comes to how they want to see that implemented. Republican-led states have passed dozens of measures tightening voting procedures in recent years, including stricter photo ID requirements, limits on voting by mail, aggressive voter roll checks, and fewer ballot drop boxes. Supporters say the changes are needed to restore public confidence in the integrity of U.S. elections. That's despite federal data showing that just 0.04% of people trying to register were non-citizens. Democrats and voting rights advocates argue the Republican-backed laws make it harder for Americans to vote. They've moved to expand early voting, to broaden early access to mail ballots, introduce automatic voter registration, and restore voting rights for some former felons. The Save America Act, as it's known, was passed by the House in April, but since then has stalled in the Senate due to widespread opposition from Democrats. It would amend the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 to introduce requirements that everyone needs to provide documentary proof of citizenship to be able to register or re-register to vote. That means a voter would need to present either a passport, a birth certificate, a certificate of citizenship, or a naturalization certificate. But tens of millions of Americans don't have those documents easily available. And if they are low-income earners, they don't have the spare cash to get them either. If you are a married or divorced woman, then there's an extra hurdle. If your name has been changed and is now different from your birth certificate, you need to show a paper trail, such as a marriage license, to connect proof of citizenship with proof of identity. Because all these documents need to be verified in person, the act would essentially eliminate mail-in registration. That would mean a lengthy drive for people living in large rural counties. It also creates a logistical problem for members of the military and their families if they're stationed in combat zones or domestic bases far away from their home states. They would need to re-verify their citizenship every time they move, which can be every few years. The legal burden falls on local election officials. They have to determine if people have provided appropriate evidence of their citizenship. Election workers could face up to 5 years in jail if they register someone who doesn't provide the required documentation. They would be deemed to be in violation of federal law, even if they act in good faith and make a clerical mistake by accepting flawed paperwork from a legitimate U.S. citizen. A lot to consider if the Save America Act passes. And as campaigns ramp up across the country, The battle over how Americans vote may prove almost as consequential as who they vote for. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And Heidi Jo Castro looks at what could happen in swing states if the requirement for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship is enforced.
Do Americans think that their voting system is broken? It's what President Donald Trump and some Republicans claim, but the public is split on whether it needs to be fixed. A recent poll by Politico asked U.S. adults whether they support or oppose requiring documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote. And this is how they answered. Just over half said they supported it, while 18% said they opposed it. 12% said they neither support nor oppose, and 7% said they don't know. Here's a sampling of opinions from voters here in Washington, D.C.
I feel like it's an expansion, like a push of power from the Trump administration.
It's a tough issue, I believe, in this country because there's so many immigrants and some people that don't have a right to vote. Perhaps it's a good idea because voting to elect officials is a privilege.
The even bigger question is, does requiring people to show proof of citizenship have an impact on the results of the elections? The Washington Post looked into the potential impact, specifically in the swing states that determine presidential elections. According to the paper's analysis, 8 out of the 15 most competitive states would likely show a rightward shift in election results favoring Republicans. The most striking example is New Mexico, where, according to the study, Democratic voters are 13% less likely than Republicans to hold documents proving their U.S. citizenship. Over time, the analysis says this shortfall could flip New Mexico from an electorate where Democrats have narrowly won in recent elections to one where Republicans have the advantage. And flipping a state in the presidential election would be the ultimate political prize for an election security measure that's supposedly not political at all.
We're joined now by Corey Crowley. He's a former congressional staffer, Republican strategist, and by Ray Locker, political journalist and presidential historian. Thank you so much for being with us on Al Jazeera. Corey, I'm going to start with you. The SAVE Act has been described as, to me at least, as a solution looking for a problem. Just how serious a problem is this?
Well, that's the hard part, is the data on this is really complicated to find because states run their own elections. They devolve that power down to localities. And in many cases, these aren't sophisticated levels of government. These are local elected officials doing the best they can with a limited number of resources. And so largely, when you look at the data, there isn't a huge problem of voter fraud. It usually comes up to not even registering as 1/100th of 1% when you really dive into it. So there's a little bit of that, but what this really is a political issue, right? This is a way for Donald Trump, the Republican Party, to get their base on board with an issue that a lot of people believe is a problem. And sometimes perception is more powerful than reality, especially in politics.
Well, exactly. And of course, we've seen that over the last several years. But Ray, every administration, of course, wants in some way to be able to manipulate, shall we say, or change the voting process in order to favor themselves. What's so different about this one?
Well, this requires people to jump through far more hoops than they've ever had to before. I don't think it's going to pass because I don't think there's the political will to pass it. And it's a solution in search of a problem because, as Corey mentioned, there's not a lot of voter fraud out here. You know, it's not the 1948 Senate election in Texas where Lyndon Johnson got people to stuff ballots at the last minute to win the runoff election. That doesn't happen anymore. It has happened, but that's really not a problem. Remember, in 2017, President Trump was upset that he didn't win the majority of the popular vote in the 2016 election, appointed a voter fraud commission. And that went nowhere, found nothing. So, he's back at it again. It's an election time, and I think it's a scare tactic.
A scare tactic in what sense? Let me ask you that, Corey, because the suggestion is that Democrats seem to be on board with the fact that there needs to be some sort of control over voting rights. It's the way in which it's done that seems to be at issue with this. I mean, in terms of getting this legislation passed, we know also, of course, that there is a constitutional element to this as well. Why is all of this happening? It seems to be an awful lot of fuss when there's a very good chance that it's going to kind of peter out at some point?
Well, not only is there a great chance it's going to peter out, and I agree, the chances of it passing are almost zero in the United States Senate, but even if it were to pass, it's not going to have a big impact on this election cycle. I mean, primaries are already underway. Ballots are going to be available for the general election in just a couple of months in many jurisdictions. So you can't implement this in a way that's going to be meaningful in these midterm elections. Maybe you could and get past the court challenges in time for a 2028 presidential race, but even then, you're looking at a lame duck president who's going to have a hard time enforcing it, and probably a Democrat-led Congress after these midterms who are going to roll it all back anyway, even if it does pass this time.
Ray, do you think this is more about creating an awful lot of hassle in the Senate and perhaps making voters just that little bit more unsure about the political process?
Yeah, if you're a Latino voter somewhere and you're worried about ICE, you've had family members swept up in some of these, ICE raids, you might think, I want to vote, but I don't know if it's worth it. Maybe there's going to be somebody at the polling place who's going to harass me. Maybe one of my relatives will get picked up for some unknown reason. So it creates a sense of uncertainty, and that often works in an election, at least around the margins.
Yeah. Let's talk about the way that this is split essentially along party lines, because as we were referring to in Heidi's package there, that there does seem to be some sort of support for it amongst Dems. And as often happens in American politics, particular in this area, we're seeing these party divisions at the moment. Just let's have a listen.
The SAVE Act is not a voter ID bill. It is in every sense a voter suppression bill. It could purge millions of American citizens from the voter rolls.
Republicans have adopted voter suppression as an electoral strategy. That's what the so-called SAVE Act is all about.
The Save America Act. Now voters would have to display a valid ID to participate in federal elections. Again, a no-brainer.
Save America Act. It is a package of common sense policies, the kind of common sense policies that should get an automatic yes vote from literally every member of this body.
There seems to be one of the impacts, which is that this is essentially putting an awful lot of emphasis on the voter themselves to provide the documentation, rather than, I believe, what's known as the back end side of it, which is the government essentially maintaining all of this. Do you think that in part there is a risk that the people are simply going to be simply going to lose interest in the concept of registering to vote, simply that it may just become too difficult for them, and as a result they simply, even if they're eligible to do it and they might be able to find the paperwork, that there is a chance that they simply won't bother because it just becomes too hard? Corey?
Well, this is the hard part about having a system that we do in America, which is a republic. In a lot of countries, you get a national ID card. That's just part of a way of life. Ours are issued by your state. They're based largely on documentation provided to you at the local level, and they're really hard to enforce. And we ran into this. I worked in the Senate when we passed what's now known as the Real ID Act, that is now, just now, 20 years later after we passed it, getting rolled out because we ran into so many issues with people being able to get the documentation they needed, with states putting the technology in place to be able to do it. So even if you require voter ID at the federal level, you have to accept that it's going to be a hodgepodge of documentation and of authorizations legitimizing that from 50 different states.
And part of the problem is that they have decided, or part of this process would be that Real ID doesn't count anymore, despite the fact that people have been going through that process of getting these IDs, and yet now it's no longer part of this. Ray, I want to ask you, because there's an element here that we were referring to in Manuel's package. There is also a greater pressure on the state level voting personnel as well, isn't there? Because it's not just a question of checking somebody through, making sure that the IDs match. There has to be a degree of authenticity, and there are greater, if I understand it correctly, there are greater pressures and possible punishments on local voting officials if they get that wrong. What do you think the chances are that even if somebody presents with what appears to be a legitimate ID, that the voting officials might default to refusing them or turning them away just because they don't want to run the risk of facing a fine?
Doesn't that happen with anything like that? Any kind of situation where you're like, if I make a mistake here, I'm in trouble. So I'm not going to make the mistake. I'm just going to blow this off and do it. And when you talk about basically any kind of human activity, if you have what's called friction, that makes it less likely for people to do things. So in this case, the friction is I have to bring more ID. I have to do this. I have to do that. I'm not going to do it because what difference does it make? So it's a disincentive for people to vote.
And the fundamental thing to remember is that while the federal government's the one ringing all the bells about this, they don't have the authority to regulate elections in this country. They're regulated at the state level. So you could pass the SAVE ID Act and have a lot of governors, a lot of attorneys general and secretaries of state around the country who say, forget it, we're not enforcing that, and we're going to let people vote the way we always have.
Yeah, and of course, Donald Trump has been consistently pushing for this to happen. He suggested the legislative program could be halted if it doesn't go through. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I'm asking you to approve the Save America Act. The Save America Act. It's the easiest thing we have. I can't. How can they fight us? The Save America Act. The Senate has to approve it. But they have to get it done, because if we don't get this done, if it takes you 6 months, I'm for not approving anything.
So the president is absolutely determined that he's going to grind things to a halt in the event that this doesn't go through. But you were saying earlier on, Ray, that you don't think this is going to happen. What do you think the ramifications of this are?
I think he'll lose interest and sign a bill, anything else, because that's how he rolls. That's what he does. He talks a lot, and then when it comes down to crunch time, he backs off. If he wants things that are going to get passed, he's going to have to give in on this. And I've talked to some members in the Senate, Republican members in the Senate, who've told me, look, we don't have the votes for this. But yet he says we're not going to be able to pass anything else. What do we do? And if you're going to Congress and you need some legislation on anything else and you can't get around this, well, you're going to start making noise to get around it. And then there's a lot of interests out there who want results out of Congress. And if they don't get them because of this, they're going to put pressure on the president to get them. And he'll probably find a way to make it happen.
Corey, let's briefly touch on the constitutional element of this, because Kansas tried this about 10 years ago, and it did not work. In fact, I think it was a federal court said described it as an unconstitutional burden. Is there a sense that it's the Constitution alone that the president simply isn't going to be able to get past, almost irrelevant of what happens in the Senate?
Well, it'll certainly face a ton of court challenges, which is why it'll never get implemented this election year, even if it were to pass tomorrow. And it won't make it even through to 2028 because of all of those same challenges. So I agree there. What I think that the president's up against, too, is a beast of his own making, which is that he's taken out reasonable, moderate Republicans in primaries now who are now lame ducks. They only have 6 more months to serve. They have less incentive to pass his legislative agenda, including the SAVE Act now, than they did a month ago. So he's losing votes by the day, not gaining them.
And we've got to remember, of course, that many of the people who might be affected by this are people who were fighting for their voting rights 10 years ago or 6 decades ago even. And now we're seeing again that many of them might be feeling, well, I'm back in the same situation again. I thought I dealt with this problem, but all of a sudden I'm facing this again. We've been hearing from one woman who's been talking about this.
We should not have to fight for the right to vote. Only 61 years have passed, and we are right back where we started in 1965 if they get their way. This is what they did after the Civil War, when so many blacks came into office. They implemented Jim Crow and went back to whites only. And that's what they're trying to do again.
You can see there, obviously, this is making a lot of people very angry, rather than perhaps making people disinterested in registering. Do you think that we are going to see, as a result of Donald Trump pushing the Save America Act, an upsurge in the number of people actually working to register?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I worked in Alabama before. I've been over the Edmund Pettus Bridge and talked to those people. It's been a while now, but those feelings are strong, and they're heavily motivated. You've seen after the striking down of parts of the Voting Rights Act, kind of surge in interest and activity in those states. And I think we'll see more of that in November.
Corey, one of the points, sorry to interrupt, but one of the points that came up was the fact, if I understand it correctly, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote. And that's where I started to get really confused about this. is it possible to even attempt to bring in legislation when there's already legislation in place, when you're essentially doing the same thing as far as I can see?
Oh, this is a favorite game of lawmakers. You always come back and take an issue that's already illegal and you make it more illegal. Or you change enforcement, right? There's a lot of angst in the legislative branch that the executive branch, in their opinion, doesn't enforce the laws as strictly as they should be. So you could make arguments, and there have been cases published, and this is what fuels this Republican fire. You can read these cases where some local election official takes it upon themselves to decide they're not going to enforce a particular law. All you need is one or two of those anecdotes to make people believe that this is a widespread problem. And that's exactly what's led to this. For 10 years, President Trump, in both his first term and then in his years out of office, has been saying this. Elections are rigged. They're not safe. They're not secure. We've got to fix it. It's fed into his narrative.
Right. And let's just remember, this guy told 33,000 documented lies during his first term as president. I mean, he lies routinely. It's all part of his shtick. And so it's hard to take it seriously. Even if there was a problem, which we don't think there is, even if there was, it's hard to take it seriously from him because he's not really a credible messenger.
Yeah, and the other problem you've got is that when I worked up in the Senate, what we heard about all the time from local governments was something called unfunded mandates. At some point, enforcement of this, if it were to pass, has to be paid for. And where's all that money coming from? And that's a real issue for state and local governments who are already cash strapped, who see their tax bases dropping, and who just don't have the money to pay for these types of things. And in many cases, election workers at precincts all across America are volunteers. These are people who just are trying to do their civic duty. And if they have now some burden to do extra work, you're going to have a much harder time getting those poll workers to show up, in which case you have to close precincts.
Ray, let me ask you about the implications for mail-in documentation and mail-in voting as well, which is obviously something Donald Trump is trying to avoid. What do you think in terms of the Save America Act? In the event that it does move forward to some degree, what are the implications for mail-in?
Well, it has some provisions that would restrict elements of mail-in voting, so that could happen. I know that he doesn't like it. He talks about it all the time, yet he's been the beneficiary of it, and he does it himself, which is what's so crazy about it. Oh, I'm going to vote, and I voted by mail. Meanwhile, don't vote by mail. You have states like Utah, heavily Republican state, relies mostly on mail-in voting. Other states do it too. So there's no real partisan advantage one way or the other. And, you know, in some cases where you've had problems with voter fraud in absentee or mail-in voter, they've benefited Republican candidates. What was that one race in North Carolina a few years ago where the guy won, but turns out he had cheated with absentee ballots, and he lost. They had a special, and they ended up with a new congressman. So, you know, it's not really a problem. He's making it a problem. And you saw in 2021 with the Senate runoffs in Georgia, his harping on that. And I think it hurt the Republican candidates in that election.
Corey, I want to ask about the impact on service members here, particularly those, of course, serving overseas. That would apply to mail-in votes. We're seeing a lot of them are in the Middle East at the moment. What kind of impact is it going to have on them, do you think?
Well, I think there'd still be a carve-out for them. I mean, nobody's going to tell the military they don't get a vote in the government. But I think one of the big philosophical things as America is celebrating its 250th anniversary this year is that the system is stronger. The system is better when more people participate. And I think if you want to do something great for this country to celebrate its birthday, make Election Day a federal holiday so that people can go vote, and make it easier on them. And maybe then, yes, you could put some safeguards in place so that you're kind of letting people have their cake and eat it too, you know. But that's how good legislation is developed, in a bipartisan way, and you give a little and take a little. So make it easy for the folks who have, you know, hourly jobs and can't get out.
Gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. I want to say thanks to Corey Crowley, former congressional staffer and Republican strategist, and Ray Locker, political journalist and presidential historian. And that is all from the team here in Washington. Going to hand you back to Manny and to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
Thanks, Rob. And don't forget that wherever you are in the world, you can always watch the latest episode of This is America, Monday through Friday, 1830 GMT. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time if you're here in the United States. From all of us here in Washington, it's goodbye for now.